Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, I want to talk about initiative. I want to talk about innovation. And we are seeing this conflict, for the most part, as we speak, turn into a relative stalemate. We are not seeing very large maneuver operations by Russian forces. We have seen failed Ukrainian maneuver operations take place south of Orikhiv and other locales. And I thought this was a good opportunity to talk about history and have a look at other wars. And from time to time, I go back to the first American Civil War. And specifically, what I want to discuss today is the early command of General Stonewall Jackson, obviously a very famous battlefield commander of the Confederate States of America. Now, what's interesting is early in the Civil War, it was perceived that Stonewall Jackson was a bit too aggressive. He had talked about flying the black flag, taking no prisoners. And one operation that got him in a bit of trouble was an early operation that took place near or in Harper's Ferry. Stonewall Jackson's very first command was in command of the defense of Harper's Ferry. Robert E. Lee wanted Harper's Ferry defended. And the first thing Stonewall Jackson did while he was in Harper's Ferry was quickly understand that the position was very difficult to defend. To the northeast, you had Maryland. Across the Potomac River, you had Maryland Heights. And Northern forces, if they occupied Maryland Heights, would be able to shell Harper's Ferry and the roughly 7,000 Confederate troops that were based there. So Stonewall Jackson took the initiative and immediately occupied Maryland Heights and then the Heights in Virginia, which is now West Virginia. So instead of letting the Northern forces establish control over the Maryland Heights and then allowing those forces to shell Harper's Ferry, he conducted an operation and seized control over those undefended heights and started fortifications in those areas. And he had some other ideas as well. But when he reported to Robert E. Lee that he had seized control of the Maryland Heights and entered Maryland proper, which had not yet succeeded, had not yet joined the South, and would never join the South. But there was concerns in Richmond that this would cause Maryland to gravitate more towards the North. Now, Stonewall Jackson did not care. He fully understood that his mission was to defend Harper's Ferry and the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. It was a very important military target for both sides. Ultimately, Stonewall Jackson was relieved of command by Robert E. Lee. And ultimately, the general that took over defense of Harper's Ferry removed those Confederate forces from Maryland Heights. Now, furthermore, Stonewall Jackson had other ideas about the war. He believed in what would now be called total war. Total war. He believed that the Confederate States could not fight a prolonged war against Northern forces. And thus a very aggressive campaign needed to be conducted by Confederate forces. What were some of his ideas? The ideas of Stonewall Jackson. Well, he felt that an operation around Washington, D.C., and a direct strike on Baltimore, to include burning Baltimore and the port facilities at Baltimore, and then an immediate march northeast, and then burn Philadelphia. He believed that the Confederacy needed to launch a catastrophic strike against the North. But in the early stages of the American Civil War, that was seen as radical. Ultimately, Robert E. Lee would indeed invade Maryland. Not once, but twice. Now, at that point in time, the North had greatly expanded military resources, and the ability of Confederate forces to launch successful operations in the North was simply something that could not occur at that time. Now, you have to ask yourself, earlier in the war, had Stonewall Jackson been allowed to do some of the things that he had talked about, what would the war look like? Would it have been different? And it's difficult to say. Some believe that it would have stunned the North into submission. Some believe that it would have enraged the Northern populace to see Confederate forces burning Baltimore and Philadelphia. It never happened. It never occurred. But towards the end, indeed, Robert E. Lee did try to invade Maryland. Now, as we look at the U.S. Civil War and we look at what is happening right now in and around Ukraine, do both sides need to look at the possibility of more innovative and aggressive commanders? I'm just asking that question. Obviously, in the early stages of the conflict, the Russians conducted some very aggressive operations. Now, I believe going into these operations, especially some of the operations that occurred near Kiev, those were not well prepared for operations that at least appear to have believed they would not run into very serious opposition. And the Russians did. They met, in fact, tenacious resistance by Ukrainian forces. Now, what has happened in terms of those operations by the Russians in the northern area of the conflict, meaning areas near Sumy, Chernihiv, Kiev. That has happened, that has occurred, and there's not much that can be done about those failed operations. And they were failure of military operations. Now the question is what happens next? At some point, the Russian leadership is going to have to reestablish innovation. They're going to have to reestablish initiative, the initiative. Now, we're not seeing a lot of initiative now on the part of the Ukrainians, especially after those battlefield defeats that took place south of Orikhiv and additional failures that occurred south of Staromayorsky. Those defeats by the Ukrainian forces have what appears to have stifled further large-scale Ukrainian operations because of the amounts of casualties the Ukrainians have taken. It also appears, as we analyze and watch this conflict, the Russians, too, are a bit shell-shocked and apprehensive about large-scale maneuver operations. Some of the operations, quite frankly, that we are seeing in this conflict really boggle my mind. Operations such as 1 or 2 tanks advancing on a defensive position. I cannot recall ever being in the military myself as a tanker, operating as a lone tank. Tanks always operated at the very least in a platoon-sized element of 4 tanks. Most of the time, we operated in company-sized elements, with adjoining company-sized elements to our left and to our right. So it's interesting to watch what is happening in this conflict and try, at least for me, to get my head around what is happening on the ground. Because things are being done that you would just have never seen, especially within the context of the U.S. military and armored formations within the U.S. military. And I imagine it has a lot to do with technology that we're seeing in this conflict. We're seeing the ability to sense and shoot on a scale never seen before, especially with NATO and the United States directly supporting the Ukrainians. So is it time for both sides to look at new and innovative commanders to change what is happening on the ground? I would say possibly. Very possible. So as always, thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.